All right, AP Worlders, here we go. We're looking at the Unit 4 reading guide, and this one's a big one. So I'm going to try to be really brief with my answers. So let's dive into this thing. All right, so we're trying to look at non-Spanish things in question one. So we know that Spain has been in North America, the Caribbean, Mexico, South America. We know that Portugal and Spain have split South America, with the Portuguese taking Brazil and Spain everything else. But now we want to know who else is involved in the exploration of North America. Well, in the book, it says Foundation of Colonies up here in the top corner on page 550. I'm sorry, on 543. And it talks about the French settling at places like Port Royal in Nova Scotia and Quebec. Then the British created colonies at Jamestown and Massachusetts Bay, which would be Boston. And even the Dutch, right, created New Amsterdam, which eventually the British take over and they name New York. All right, so then question two wants to know, how did they govern differently than the Spanish? So in the Spanish New World, right, we had audiencias, right? These ideas of kind of like direct representatives of the Spanish king. And he had little governors, or what they called viceroys, who ruled over or administered government there. It's not really how it worked in the French and British colonies. There, although there was royal permission or royal authority, they also, and this is key, they maintained their own assemblies. Okay. And so they kind of had some levels of what would be called here at the bottom, self-government. So even though the king gave them the right to go, what happened in the meantime was kind of left up to the local governments to choose what they did. Okay. The second part here, it says, how did they legitimize their land claims? And we can find that at the bottom. And so really they tried to create contracts, right? Their goal was to try to bring about settlements or treaties or agreements. All right. And so it says English settlers particularly sought to provide legal cover for their expanding communities by negotiating treaties. The French tried to come up with trade agreements with Native Americans and then claimed river systems for their own, so that other Europeans didn't have the right to settle along those rivers. So by claiming the headwaters of the Mississippi, the French then controlled everything along that river all the way down to New Orleans in Louisiana, which is why that's a French place, the French Quarter, right? So even though they were up in Canada, that whole river system became theirs because of treaties and settlements. All right, question three then says, explain what is meant by mestizo populations, and we're supposed to complete this chart over here on the right. So now we're going back to the Spanish colonies. So when you think about the conquistadors and these explorers, usually they're white European men. And so that means that you've got maybe 100 to 300 explorers or conquistadors in a group, but probably not women. So as they're setting up colonies and conquering into native populations, as you can imagine, men do manly things. And so there's intermarrying, although probably nastier than that. And so mestizo is a term used to talk about people of mixed ethnicities. And so what ends up happening is a completely different social hierarchy develops in the New World. And so at the top, you have the peninsulares, and those are white Europeans that are just living in the New World, and they would be the highest level of society. The Creoles are white Europeans. They're pure blood or pure white descendancy, but born in the New World. So maybe my father started this colony and, brought along his wife or, whatever. And so now as his son, I'm still purely Portuguese. And so I'm a Creole, born in the New World, but I'm white. Below that is where we start to get mixed ethnicity. I'm not saying that to be rude. And some of these terms could be considered offensive in different parts of the Americas today. So I wouldn't encourage you to use these terms. I'm using them from a historical perspective. But mestizo then is a combination of that white European and a native population. Mulatto, again, very offensive term in some areas, is a mix between white Europeans and then Africans. So whether a free African or, sadly, because of the inappropriateness of the African slave trade, you would have mixed ethnicity there. And then below that, sadly, were the more uniform or homogeneous groupings of ethnicities, Native Americans, and then slave populations at the very bottom. Okay. So then we're also looking at the experience and the treatment of men and women within society. And so on 546, if we look at the hierarchy, sexual hierarchy here, it says women lived in a patriarchal world where men occupied positions of power and delineated the powers at the top. So women did have ability to kind of like run the house, and they could punish slaves, as it mentions here, but otherwise, as far as like administration of the colonies and society, that was really a man's world. Okay, and so it says women experience also varied to a degree of prosperity and nature in the local economy. Women move from childhood through marriage and motherhood, from being widows to spinsters. Now, here's the last part of this question. Race and class usually figured as powerful forces too. Women of European descent usually had some level of elite prestige or had some authority in the game. By necessity, women of color and low class became part of the labor force, performing tasks closely tied to the commercialization of traditional world roles. So for things like food prep, laundry, for example, it says, although poor, these women were freer to move about in public and interact with others, though, than white women. So white women had these very rigid roles in society. They had a job. They weren't supposed to look better than men, where sadly, women of these lower classes actually had a little bit more freedom because although they had to work, no one really kind of restricted their movements. All right, so now question 5 and 6 kind of go together. We're looking at something called the Midas system and then the impact that silver had on global trade. So the Midas system was actually a labor system that existed before the Spanish had showed up in the New World. The Inca used this, and it's actually a form of collecting tribute. So what happens in the Midas system is instead of paying like a tax with money or coins, you would pay with work, right? So you would show up and do a job. So the Spanish decided that in the mines, the silver mines of Mount Potosi, which is one of the richest silver veins in the world, they would use a kind of a version of this Midas system to require local natives to help mine out the silver. Now, it was super successful. The amount of silver that flowed out of Potosi was so significant that they flood the global market with silver. Now, we've talked about this already. So for the next question, how did this impact global exchange? It led to Manila galleons. American silver was loaded onto ships, sailed across the Pacific, and it made it to places like the Philippines and Japan, where that silver was exchanged then for items like porcelain and silk, which then rode back across the Pacific on these galleons to places like Central America, where it'd be offloaded, shipped across land, reloaded on yet another galleon, and taken back to Europe. So you have this truly global network of exchange linking 4 or 5 continents together, and it's used or it's using silver because the Asian market, specifically China, was dependent on consuming silver. The luxury goods were being consumed in Europe, and so there's your exchange. Okay, so how did labor or how did work actually get done in the Spanish New World? So Spain, for question 7 then, it says, what is debt peonage and how essential was forced labor? Forced labor was completely essential. 1, you had very small populations of Europeans, and 2, the native populations had died in large numbers because of smallpox and conquest. And so the Spanish set up haciendas, which were basically these large, wealthy estates that the noble Spaniards lived in. So your peninsulares and Creoles, maybe high-level mestizos lived in these haciendas. But they needed people to do the work for them. And so that's where we get into this idea of called an encomienda system. And in that encomienda system, basically the people who lived in that area were viewed as kind of like part of the property, so long as the Spanish owners took care of their people. And so we get to this concept known as debt peonage. And basically what debt peonage means is that you're going to get paid, but you're going to work to pay off those loans or debts that you have. So like, let's say You need, as a farmer, to buy land and seed and tools. So you're going to go into debt $100 to buy those things. But then you're going to farm and sell your produce, and hopefully you make $50, and then you give some of that back to pay off your loans. And so over time, hopefully you can pay off your debts and be free. Sadly, it's called debt peonage because most of those people who are working never are able to actually achieve surplus income and then remain in debt kind of perpetually. So you get close to free and then more debt, and then you get close. And so you're working for freedom. You're not really a slave necessarily, but you're actually not free because you're never getting out of this system of debt. All right, so question 8, what we're looking at is how did some of the native populations resist Spanish rule? And there's a couple. All right, so what was a very common thing was rebellions. All right, so we notice across the Spanish Empire rebellion. So one of the more popular or common ones that's kind of famous was the Pueblo revolts. Okay, and so in Southwest America, we had an uprising. Basically, it focused on killing missionaries and priests and local farm populations, people kind of running haciendas. And so it went on and on for years. The Spanish actually withdrew. Sadly, they came back later in force and crushed the revolt. There's another famous one called the Amaru rebellions. And so basically what happened is for several years, there was a rebellion against the Spanish up in the areas that had once been the Inca Empire. Now, rebellion and violent revolt wasn't the only way. We also noticed that sometimes there was a usage of Spanish law, and sometimes even priests of the Spanish Empire would help native populations, in essence, kind of submit grievances to the Spanish king, hoping that he would kind of intervene and protect them from brutal colonial overlords. And so, for example, they give the story of Ayala, who was down in Peru, and basically they wrote this huge 1,000-some page document asking King Philip III of Spain to get involved and protect the native populations from rape and torture and overworking, to limited success. But both were clearly methods of resistance. All right, so questions 9 and 10 are looking at the difference between the Spanish and the Portuguese and the impact that some of their practices would have on forced migrations. So there's two real major things that we're looking at. So we're looking at the bottom of 549, and it says, although the Spanish had really been interested in extracting silver from places like Potosi, the Portuguese were actually more interested in cultivation of cash crops, and most specifically, sugar. And because of that, labor practices would be different too. Silver extraction, remember Spain used the Midas system and they used debt peonage on their small haciendas. Portugal, in order to earn profits, were going to have large plantations, or what they know as ingenio, engines. And so they needed large labor forces because sugar is a very difficult, labor-intensive commodity to cultivate and process. And so they right away brought in African slaves to try to fill in the plantations and these ingenio. And so what this does is long-term, looking at question 10, the numerous causes for the reliance on the African slaves. One, it's just the insane amount of labor required to produce sugar. Two, the native populations had died because of smallpox and other diseases in large numbers, leaving a small supply of laborers in the New World. All right, so question 11 is looking at what two products became critical to North American trade, and then why were they so popular, and what did they do to the world? And so, pretty obvious one, tobacco, and then other cash crops. We're going to specifically look at cotton. All right, so tobacco and cotton. Now, tobacco was really popular for a couple of reasons, but none more so than the fact that it was just viewed as exotic and otherworldly. So for the elite, it was a way to show off your noble, wealthy status. Also, over time, doctors and other people kind of tapped into this idea that there could be medicinal qualities. And so they tried to prescribe it as medicines as a way to relax people. Because it was held in high reverence by native populations as maybe even sacred or something spiritual, I think Europeans also kind of found it as just sensual or exciting. We all know that tobacco is also highly addictive. And so after several generations of people, specifically in the 1600s, starting to dabble with tobacco consumption, we noticed that those effects will skyrocket. Tobacco also became very popular elsewhere in the old world, specifically in the Arab areas. So when we talked about like the gunpowder empires, the Ottomans, the Safavids, the Mughal, all of those empires eventually became really interested culturally in um, tobacco and coffee, but tobacco became a staple. And then lastly, we have cotton, and that will really start to grow when we get into the 1700s, especially in England, as they start to dabble with mercantilism and processing that cotton into cloth, cloth into clothing, and then developing factories in the Industrial Revolution. Now, the second part of the question, the next question is indentured servitude. It says, what is an indentured servant and why would people go through this? So basically, indentured servitude is like being a 7-year slave in essence. It means that you're going to like kind of sell yourself as a forced laborer. Now, people would do this for several reasons. You might be unemployed and be racking up huge debts. You might have been a political prisoner or a criminal. Maybe you were a captive in war, or maybe you were an orphan. People who had it rough. And so I'm basically saying that for 7 years, I might work for a wealthy owner of a joint stock company or a colony. But after 7 years of being your worker, I could earn my freedom. I could become a free, independent person. And so there's a real perk to my labor. All right, so question 13 is looking at conversion and why a lot of natives were resistant to becoming Christian, and then what eventually happened with some syncretic faiths or the blending of religion. So Spain, like many Europeans, but Spain really being an early nice example of people motivated by God, really believed that they had to try to convert non-Christians. It was in their interest also, partially because the Spanish crown wanted to consider native citizens and tax them and have them be part of their empire. And so there were schools and programs set up. Missionaries were sent to the New World to try to convert and teach. They set up schools and tried to spread Spanish culture. A lot of native populations were really resistant, though. They wanted to continue to observe their pre-European faith. So they didn't want to give up on their old belief systems. We did see that in some places with the outbreak of disease, that did motivate conversion just out of fear and paranoia. But there was a lot of desire to hang on to tradition. Now, over time, once the Catholic Mass was understood and the concept of saints and miracles, we do notice a syncretic faith developing. And one example that the book dives into here is, for example, the Virgin of Guadalupe. And so basically what they try to do is merge this idea of a local population, right? So a mestizo or a native woman who clearly had been given kind of a connection, a miracle by God. And so it says gained a reputation as a miracle worker on behalf of the individuals there. The Virgin of Guadalupe, with her darker indigenous complexion, came to symbolize a distinctly Mexican version of faith. And so it became part of Mexican heritage and cultural identity, nationalism, and yet it still connects to Roman Catholicism brought by the Spanish. Okay, so then the next question is talking about in question 13, what devastating effect did Europeans have on Oceania? The same thing that happened in the New World. Australia had not been discovered by Europeans until the 1700s when it was colonized. So they were chronically isolated, just like the islands of the Pacific had been chronically isolated. And so the same vulnerabilities to European diseases that the native populations had, so too the native and aboriginal populations experience in Oceania. All right, so we don't see a lot of permanent settlements in Australia, and that's largely because there already were populations living here. The Aboriginal people had societies set up for fishing and foraging, and oftentimes the Europeans viewed them as quite frightening, referred to them as savages. And so kind of on a racist / fear level, it just didn't seem worth it to try to settle in these very harsh, oftentimes, environments of Australia. And then finally, 16, why didn't the Spanish mariners set up permanent settlements on these Pacific islands? And really, it's because they didn't offer enough to the Spanish, right? There were populations there. Many of them were decimated by disease. They did use some of these places as refueling stops, but there weren't really markets there to be beneficial. They weren't going to cultivate products. And so as the Manila galleons kind of traversed, they could use them for fresh water and resupplying, but not much else. All right, guys, I hope this helped. I'll talk to you soon. Bye.